What democracy? Within an hour of the victory of Syriza in the general election in January, German Finance Minister Wolfgang Schäuble declared, "The election alters nothing. There is no alternative to structural reforms," which were those demanded in the earlier memorandum of agreement with the Troika of the IMF, the ECB, and the European Commission. Alexis Tsipras made the modest proposal by Yanis Varoufakis, myself, and James Galbraith the basis of the negotiating position of the Syriza government with the EU. This modest proposal argued that a European recovery is entirely feasible with existing institutions, without treaty changes, without national guarantees, without fiscal transfers, without needing to wait. Jeroen Dijsselbloem, chair of the Eurogroup, ruled this out of order and refused to allow it to be tabled for discussion. Yet on what authority does the Eurogroup of Eurozone finance ministers deign or decide anything? As Yanis has said, the Eurozone is run by a body, the Eurogroup, that lacks written rules of procedure, debates crucial matters confidentially, and without minutes being taken or published, and is not obliged to answer to any elected body, not even the European Parliament. The outcome is that while Greece was the cradle of European democracy, austerity risks being the grave of European democracy. Germany no longer is locked into a democratic Europe, as was the ambition of chancellors such as Adenauer, Brandt, Schmidt, and Kohl, but is locking Europe into a German ideological and political hegemony. Now, I make quite a bit about these concepts: displacement, denial, and projective identification. Now, both Freud and Jung recognize subconscious displacement and denial. Melanie Klein added to this projective identification of something presumed good or bad in oneself onto someone or something else. What I'm submitting is the Eurozone crisis is the first time since World War II and the Holocaust that Germany has been able to project herself as good because in surplus, and southern member states as bad because they are not. Now, I'm going to project a figure which at least a third to a half of you have already seen. Don't reply when I ask the question, what is this? Who has not seen it before? You've not seen it before? Well, Richard, let's have a go.
My wife is a primatologist, so I'm still trying to make animals sensitive.
It's the head of a black swan.
Ah, yes. Yes, okay. Yeah.
On the right-hand side.
It's, the figure on the right-hand side is from Jastrow, Gestalt psychologist, 1880s, and the left is a representation of it by Wittgenstein in his philosophical investigations. It's known as the duck-rabbit figure. Now, is it a duck or is it a rabbit? It's how we perceive it. And in fact, as a master's student observed to me at a seminar at Coimbra, you know, if you see it from the right, it's more like a rabbit. If you see it from the left, it's more like a duck. And maybe, if your politics is not only of the center, if you see the Eurozone crisis from the right, you see it differently from if you see it from the left. Now, it's all about perception. So here's perception one, debt as guilt. In his Genealogy of Morals, Friedrich Nietzsche stressed the dual meaning of the word Schuld, which in German and Dutch, Jeroen Dijsselbloem, means both debt and guilt. Nietzsche also stressed that strong German creditors not only wanted, he's writing in the 1880s, not only wanted repayment from weak debtors, but to punish them for their debt guilt. But the inverse perception of debt is lending as credit. The inverse of borrowing is credit. And without credit, Europe could still be in a semi-stationary state of neo-feudalism, which Adam Smith feared for 18th century Britain. While credit reflects belief rather than mistrust or blame, as in the rather powerful first word of the Christian creed, credo. Also, credit was not invented in Germany or on the upper reaches of the Rhine, well, on the Middle Rhine, but by these profligate, irresponsible, untrustworthy southern European Italians. It was in Florence by the Medici, and also by the Venetians through the Greek diaspora in the Western Mediterranean in which they traded. Nor was the rise of capitalism due to Weber's Protestant ethic. Now, you need to be a brave sociologist if you actually read Weber's Protestant ethic. I mean, it's about 690 pages long. And there are very few Germans reading Bildzeitung who are likely to have done so. But they have heard the words Protestant ethic, and they think this caused the rise of capitalism. But both Luther and Calvin actually opposed the credit, and thus usury, interest that was crucial for the rise of capitalism. And through the 16th centuries and 17th centuries, continual prohibitions of usury, interest on borrowing, were issued by the synods of the Protestant French Huguenots and by those of the Dutch reformers, whose ethical code also condemned excessive labor as diverting time and energy from the service of God. Now, the next slide shows the projections by the European Commission. How much do we trust technocrats? Of how austerity in the short term for Greece would recover confidence in the private sector and ensure economic recovery. Now, the upturns in the figure from 2008 to 2013 are those of the Commission's predictions. The downturns on the left are those that ensued, that happened, which the Commission hasn't omitted. So, here we go. We're going to have, we haven't got any point, but first we're going to have an upturn here by 2009-10, then at least a leveling out by 2010. And then when things still decline, well, there'll be an upturn by 2011. This is what happened. And Greek GDP, as I think many people know, declined by a quarter. None of the upturns on the right happened. Then there not only has been a displacement that Germany did not meet the Maastricht debt and deficit rules when they were agreed, but broke the rules in 2004 with impunity. There's been displacement also that 48% of Germany's debt was cancelled by the London Conference of 1953, whereas Germany now has refused any reduction even of the debt of Greece, Spain, or Portugal. And there's also a general perception, misperception, in Germany that inflation caused the rise of Hitler. Now, hyperinflation in Germany followed French reoccupation of the Rhineland in 1923. German firms, if you like, capital, responded with a strike, closing the firms, and the Weimar Republic paid the wages of firms that were no longer producing. Now, you don't need a Nobel Prize in economics to know that if you're paying people when they don't produce, the result could be inflationary. But the hyperinflation was tamed by a currency reform with the introduction of a new Rentenmark, plus the US Dawes Plan of 1923, which again cancelled a major share of Germany's debt. And what caused the rise of Hitler was not hyperinflation, but hyperdeflation, austerity and mass unemployment. In 1929, following the collapse of the Kreditanstalt in Austria and the Wall Street crash and the financial crash, the German Chancellor Heinrich Brüning introduced a mass austerity program, such as Germany now is demanding of the rest of Europe. In 1929, the support for the Nazis was less than 3%. After they had 4 years of austerity, it was 43%. Now, this was an economic disaster for Germany, as it also has been, and for Europe, with the rise of Hitler, as it also has been under Troika policies for Greece. As illustrated in the next figure, derived from Gustav Horn, the comparison is exact. With deflation, unemployment soared in both Weimar Germany and from 2008 in Greece. I'm quite skeptical of correlation claiming cause and effect, but sometimes the correlations are so exact and the analogies are very similar. There's also a fatal fallacy within the case being argued by Wolfgang Schäuble in claiming that Germany only wants other member states to compete and to be more export competitive. For, he said in an article in The Guardian in 2013, he said, the German question is back. Die deutsche Frage ist zurück, meaning Germany is a menace. Oh no, it's not a menace, he said. We don't want to dominate Europe, we only want other countries to compete. But not every EU member state can achieve export-led growth. One member state's surpluses have to be others' deficits. Then there's multipliers. Now, hands up who's heard of an economic multiplier? I have. 2, 3, 4, 5, yes. Not everybody, all right. But let's start very simply. We teach children that multiplying a minus number by a minus number gives a plus. But negative economic multipliers, an economic multiplier is, for example, if you put 100 euros into an economy, or 100 billion, and you save 20, you're spending 80, or 80 billion, and therefore this multiplies. But negative economic multipliers, if you inversely cut 100 euros or 100 billion euros, are not like the multiplication we teach to children. They're cumulatively negative. The IMF, there had been a change in the IMF with Dominique Strauss-Kahn, whom I can't forgive for certain other misfortunes, but he appointed somebody called Olivier Blanchard to be head of IMF research. And Blanchard is both intelligent and informed and honest. So he and Lee, in an IMF working paper in January 2013, admitted that the IMF had underestimated negative multipliers in the EU by a factor of more than 3, i.e. they got it 300% wrong, and that the negative multipliers could be 1.7 rather than the early assessment of 0.5. Now, most positive fiscal multipliers, if you either cut tax or spend, have a multiplier of 1 to 1.8. But investment multipliers, such as by the European Investment Bank, range from 2.5 to 3. So what that means is if the European Investment Bank invests 100 billion, that multiplies to 250 or 300 billion. Then there's Milton Friedman crowding out hypothesis. In other words, putting in these simpler words, public spending sustains rather than drains the private sector. Friedman said it drains the private sector, so you shouldn't have public spending. And again, IMF, unlike the crowding out hypothesis of Friedman, recent research has found there's no evidence that public spending drains rather than sustains the private sector. There's a reference to that there. And I can't resist saying that I actually had the privilege in the Commons of raising this with Margaret Thatcher. My constituency was right opposite the House of Commons. It includes a hospital called St. Thomas's Hospital. The head of the oncology unit, cancer unit, came to me and said, the minister wants to close the unit. So I called for a debate and cutting it all short. It was late at night. Normally, prime ministers are only in there for the prime minister's questions, the confrontation. And she sat down. So I gave her, trying not to use academic words, an introduction to the circularity of income and expenditure, which is Keynes. And I said, I know the Right Honourable Lady is very impressed by the economics of Milton Friedman, and especially his crowding out hypothesis, but let us just consider, even if, when a hospital is built, sorry, I shouldn't be distracted. When a National Health Service hospital is built, it's built with public money. But who builds it? Private contractor. When its operating theatre is equipped, very expensively, it's public expenditure, but who makes the equipment? The private sector. When a drug is prescribed, who prescribes it and is paid for it? The private sector, and so on and so forth. Now, so this coincides with common sense, but common sense is rather missing. And I once said this to an audience, and my son said, "Yes, Dad, but, tell them what happened to the unit." It did happen to be saved. She leant over to the junior minister on the front bench, who was almost wetting himself because junior ministers don't talk to prime ministers. They're just appointed by whips, the business managers. And she had a few words in his ear, and hope springs eternal. I thought, well, maybe we're going to save this unit. In fact, it did, but I fear that was the first introduction she got to the circularity of income and expenditure. And it was quite late. It was late 1988 or 89, 10 years after getting into power. Then again, the Troika with Schäuble has been demanding structural reforms, which are a euphemism for reducing employee rights. Yet the IMF's World Economic Outlook of April, again, Blanchard's influence, analyzing OECD data, 27 OECD countries, did not find any negative effects on productivity or efficiency from job security that result from a defense of employee rights through protective labor legislation. Now, this one is a big one. It's so big, it's a bit hard to grasp. Lending by the European Investment Bank is about 3.5 to 4 times that of the World Bank. I don't have to ask you to put up your hand to show if you've ever heard of the World Bank. But who's heard of the European Investment Bank? I'm getting a rough idea here. It's only about 1 in 10 of you. Its lending is 3.5 to 4 times bigger than the World Bank. It's our bank. It's Europe's bank. It's non-profit, so it doesn't have to charge high interest rates. It will charge you 1/5 of 1% above base rate and lend the money to you for 30 years if the project is good. Well, but in a workshop in Brussels last December, none of the advisors, and the other point is its lending doesn't count on national debt. Yet at a workshop in Brussels last December, none of the advisors to President Tusk or Juncker, to the Commissioner for Employment, nor the senior economist to the Commission, nor the number 2 representative of the IMF to the EU, actually realize this. Well, it does make rather a difference, If you have a recovery program, and half of it need not count on national debt, you needn't be so obsessed about debt as guilt, debt as Schuld. You needn't really be obsessed at all. So, thanks to Antonio Guterres, the Amsterdam Special Action Programme in 1997 remitted the European Investment Bank to invest in health, education, urban regeneration, green technologies, I touched on this, I think, this morning, but perhaps it's clearer if it's on the screen, and small and medium firms. The economic advisor to Guterres said to me, Stuart, urban regeneration. We live in urban societies. This could mean anything. And then paused, and I realized he wanted to say something else, which presumably is what you want. And of course it was. The European Investment Bank can finance any investment. And that wasn't known either by Juncker's special advisor on a new fund they've invented, which is completely futile and completely unneeded. Now, European Investment Bank, by tradition, has only co-financed 50% of investments. Now, that's a house rule, not a treaty revision. Even that is not, for once, demanded by Germany. But the European Investment Fund, which I proposed to the law he set up and now as part of the EIB group, can issue Eurobonds without these counting on national debt. Now, the BRICS stated in Washington last September that if such bonds were for recovery of the European economy, they would invest in them. And the oil price has fallen, but one of them, at least, China, has got some very substantial reserves. Now, this means that Europe has the equivalent of US Treasury bonds, which do not count on the debt of American states such as California or Delaware, without needing fiscal federalism or fiscal transfers between states or national guarantees, nor new institutions, nor treaty revisions. Thus, joint EIB, up to 50%, plus EIF Eurobonds could fund a European New Deal. Now, the Roosevelt New Deal reduced US unemployment from over a fifth to less than a tenth by shifting savings into public economic and social investments. They were economic and social and environmental. And the Tennessee Valley Authority for the Deep South combined all of these. It also did so with an average annual federal deficit until the war of only 3%, because this was not Keynesian fiscal deficit spending, i.e. the original target of the Stability and Growth Pact. Now, this figure is simply too small for you to see, but it summarizes the case. In other words, excess national debt, excess because they bailed out banks instead of the bank shareholders paying the price, can be reduced by EIF and EIB bonds, funding investments in these eco and social areas I've talked to you about, and with the multipliers. The lower line, upward arrows are multipliers. Now, in his address to the European Parliament for adoption as President of the Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker made his top priority a 300 billion investment recovery to be financed by EIB bonds, European Investment Bank bonds. And then we've got the multiplier. So you've got, from 650 to 900 billions of investment. So what's 100 billion? Well, 100 billion is just under the Commission's own resources. About 120 billion is 1% of European GDP. This would be equivalent to an investment stimulus matching that of post-war Marshall aid. When he was presidential candidate, some of you know this little tale, François Hollande said that he would follow the advice of the former British Labour Member of Parliament and economist, le bien nommé Stuart Holland, to issue Eurobonds to mutualize debt and finance investment-led recovery. Well, he didn't, not least because his finance minister, Michel Sapin, who also knew the case, had no support in the unconstitutional Eurogroup of Eurozone finance ministers from either Italy or Germany. But, Matteo Renzi is increasingly concerned that the Commission will not learn up. Think of that diagram. And has said that if it rejects Italy's current budget, he'll ignore it. And in my view, quite rightly. And then you get an issue of power. How many divisions has the Commission? Yes? What's it going to do if Italy chooses to disregard it? The recent general election in Portugal has been indecisive. There's a broad coalition of the centre-left and left rejecting austerity, which is a parliamentary majority, but has not been invited to form a government by Cavaco Silva, who's not a complete, I think you can guess the next word, who's not completely foolish. He was trained at York and trained at a faculty which was actually Keynesian at the time, and he has actually said that there can be virtuous deficits. But he's deeply conservative, and so he invited Passos Coelho to form another right-wing pro-austerity government. But the combined forces of the left could mean that the government could fall on a motion of no confidence, and some people are predicting that may be next week. In Spain, PSOE, Ciudadanos, Podemos are all opposed to austerity, and in current opinion polls they are well ahead of the governing People's Party, and there's a general election in December, which the UK in principle could support, which comes to what to me is an interesting point. In 2011, George Osborne, another apostle of austerity, said he would support Eurobonds if they were for a recovery of the EU economy, because this would be good for British trade. He's still finance minister, and David Cameron badly needs to show that Europe adds value for the UK if he's to win a referendum on membership, either next year or almost certainly in 2017. Can social movements challenge and change hegemony? Well, they did in May '68 under much less plausible conditions for social challenge. In societies which at the time were in full or near full employment and not overtly in a legitimation crisis as now. The May '68 not only hit the imagination of a younger generation, but it also hit the streets. In media, social and political impact meant that Charles de Gaulle left Paris by helicopter to safeguard himself in a French military base in Germany. And the word END is not only final over and out, but an acronym for European nuclear disarmament. In the 1980s, do I explain why? Yeah, European nuclear disarmament was not the apocalyptic aspiration to abolish all nuclear weapons, but it was to stop the deployment of cruise missiles, which were tactical nuclear weapons, and to stop putting atomic shells in tanks, because, again, you don't need Nobel in anything to realize that whoever may lose the lower level of escalation is likely to escalate. And it mobilized massive support within political parties of the center-left, including SPD in Germany, and mass demonstrations throughout Europe. And it's worth bearing in mind that Sigma, am I critical of Germany? No, I'm really critical of Schauble. But we should bear in mind that, for example, Sigma Gabriel said in 2011 that Germany should mutualize the debt of other countries. And Joschka Fischer said in 2010 that it would be a tragic, former Green, still a Green, former foreign minister, that it would be a tragedy if for the third time in a century Germany were to destroy the rest of Europe without this time even firing a shot. I have a couple more slides with that. Now, END, European nuclear disarmament, played a key role in the nuclear arms limitation start agreements. And in my view, a similar mass movement supporting governments opposed to austerity and demanding a new deal for Europe is possible. How do I know this? On the played a key role in the START program. Neil Kinnock was going to make his first visit to Moscow, and he asked me if I'd go ahead and prepare the way, do a bit of Sherpa job. And the person I saw was the number 2 in the party, Chernayev, and we talked through the whole case on what could be the consequences if a Labour government demanded the removal of cruise missiles from US bases. The SPD, in opposition at the time, was already committed to demanding their renewal. then only Italy would have them, and therefore Italy would be the only target. And Chernayev agreed. It's a bit, in a way, what am I trying to say here? It's anecdotal, but actually it's a bit plus. It's not just enough to have a mass movement. You've got to have a dialogue with some of the key decision makers to see that they understand. Wasn't this a theme in the last session? Who understands what? And it was out of the process of that that Chernayev agreed. And then, unfortunately, Labour didn't win the next election. Okay, I think that's enough from me. Oh, no, this. Adam Smith is well known for his metaphor of an invisible hand, and that it's not from benevolence that bakers, brewers, and butchers are in business. Rather than, it's not benevolent. He's less known for his claim that he is not a good citizen who does not wish to promote by every means in his power the welfare and the whole society of his fellow citizens.